So, your company has decided to become more customer-centric. That's great, but it's not as easy as you think.
When you talk about a customer-first mindset and celebrating that, I actually celebrate not the customer, but customer heterogeneity. I celebrate the differences across the customers.
Some common mistakes and pitfalls in becoming a more customer-centric company on this episode of the CX Leader Podcast.
The CX Leader Podcast with Steve Walker is produced by Walker, an experience management firm that helps our clients gain a competitive advantage by delivering an exceptional experience for their customers. You can find out more at walkerinfo.com.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Walker, the host of the CX Leader Podcast, and thank you for listening. On the CX Leader Podcast, we explore the topics and themes to help leaders like you leverage all the benefits of your customer experience and help your customers and prospects want to do more business with you. If you couldn't tell already from the 80-plus episodes of this podcast, we're big advocates of a customer-first approach to business. When companies decide that they're going to become more customer-centric, we celebrate. But there are potential pitfalls for companies becoming more customer-centric, and my guest on the episode this week is an expert in customer centricity. Peter Fader, professor of marketing at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and also co-author of the book, The Customer Centricity Playbook. And he's joining us today via Zoom to talk about some of the common mistakes and pitfalls in moving towards a more customer-centric strategy. Peter, thanks for being on the CX Leader Podcast.
Steve, it's great to talk to you.
Well, I'm really proud to have you on. We haven't had as many scholars and academics on the podcast as we probably should, and I know from my experience in the business, a lot of what we do in the commercial field of research and trying to understand human behavior as it applies to customer experience, it has its roots in academia. So I'm just delighted that you chose to join us on the podcast.
Well, sure. I'm not just an academic. That's certainly the day job, and that's how I've kind of built my skills and reputation. But I care a whole lot about practice, and I learn just as much from talking to practitioners as I do from talking to other scholars. And I'd like to believe that I can contribute to the practitioner community as much as I've contributed to the scholarly one.
That is the pinnacle of combining what is the best in academic research and then applying it actually in the real world. That's really what I think drives our economy and drives this whole thought about customer centricity. Why don't you give our listeners just a little bit of your background and how you got interested in this topic?
Sure thing. So again, first and foremost, professor here at the Wharton School for 33 years now, having a great time with it, doing pretty much the same thing all that time, which is building predictive models. So how long will this particular customer stay with us? How many transactions will they make over that horizon? What will they be worth? How do these customers differ from each other? How do they change over time? Just building predictive models of customer behavior. And it turns out that these models work super well. And around 10, 15 years ago, I really made it a mission to get these models, these concepts, frameworks out there. And I was just really frustrated by companies either pushing back or just not wanting to deal with it or dismissing it, saying, yeah, it's just a bunch of academic stuff. So in the process, wrote 2 different books, started up 2 different companies, really trying to find ways to take these models and get people to pay attention to them. Man on a mission. And I look around at a lot of the so-called best practices in customer centricity and customer experience, as well as just a lot of the conventional wisdom from the so-called experts. And a lot of it's wrong. A lot of it sounds good. It really is accepted as conventional wisdom, but it's actually not well aligned with what we see in the actual data. And so I believe that a lot of folks who are hoping to find success in this area are kind of chasing after bad practices and kind of need to wake up and shake things up.
So what are just some of the common pitfalls or some of the common mistakes that you see in your work?
Steve, you actually almost stepped into one of those traps in your introduction. When you talk about a customer-first mindset and celebrating that, actually, for me, and I'll really use these words, it's just a wonderful alignment here. I actually celebrate not the customer, but customer heterogeneity. I celebrate the differences across the customers, that there is no singular customer. You'll go crazy if you, or at least be unprofitable if you say, what is it that the customer wants? How can we accommodate the customer? When you start looking at the data, when you really start understanding it, customers are wildly different from each other in their wants and their needs, and in particular, in their projected financial value to the company. And so customer centricity to me isn't about focusing our efforts around the customer. It's looking at this crazy wide spectrum of customers and saying which ones are the ones that we want to be centered around, that we really want to look at disproportionately, redouble our efforts for. The other ones, we're happy to do business with them too, but they're not going to get the same attention and the same level of resources that the really valuable ones will get.
Okay, so one of the mindsets is that we want to look for the right kind of customers?
That is it. That is it. Then not all customers are created equal, and for various different reasons, some of which might be pretty hard to measure or manage, some customers are just going to be inherently better for us. They're going to be inherently more valuable, inherently more responsive to our offers, inherently easier to manage, and perhaps to find more like them. And it's just a matter of figuring out who are the right customers for you, acknowledging that most customers aren't right for you. And again, it doesn't mean that you want to fire them. It doesn't mean you want to be rude to them. But at the same time, you don't want to be quite as responsive to them as you'd be to those so-called right customers.
Yeah, actually, I got to watch my language here because one of the fundamentals of our approach is we try to segment customer set based on how much they like doing business with you and what their intended behavior is to that. So our approach is very much trying to find out the customers that are going to be profitable and actually are going to enhance your business model as opposed to those that detract from you.
Well said, my friend, well said. And basically, I want to take exactly what you said. I want to agree with all of it and just go one step further. Those customers who like what you do, there's that good chemistry there, there's this sense that you can be a genuine trusted advisor for them. I want to go one step further and quantify it. And with this notion of customer lifetime value, a concept that these days everyone's talking about, which is great because that wasn't the case 20 years ago. But I want to make it real. I want to make it very accountable. I want to talk about all the different use cases that arise once you can see that projected financial value of each customer. So what you laid out is perfect. I just want to provide rocket fuel with it so that we can really be sure that they'll come with the right segments, with the right programs for the customers in each of those segments. And on the back end, we can measure how much ongoing financial value have we contributed as a result of those efforts.
Do you have any tips or any insights for people that are out there listening and say, man, that sounds great, Peter, but I don't really know how to do that, and I don't even know how to access that data. What are some of the first steps that a practitioner could take?
That is my job, is to develop the methods and to try to make them as accessible as possible. Turns out that while a lot of people get the idea of customer lifetime value, but they'll be somewhat dismissive of our ability to really measure it in a kind of a regular, rigorous way. They'll say, oh, the customers are too different. Oh, the business is changing all the time, competition, regulation, whatever. I'm saying, no, you actually can do it, and it's not as hard as you think. And a lot of this is going to be a tip of the cap to our forefathers in direct marketing. I just can't imagine that any of your listeners aspire to be direct marketers when they think about the kind of classic image of when they hear those words. But really, everything that we're trying to do in the CX world really is direct marketing. It really is. Instead of just looking at the customers in some faceless mass, is understanding them on a more individualized basis and trying to think about what products and services we can do for them and with them. So our forefathers in direct marketing, they're the ones who really invented this concept of customer lifetime value and spent a lot of time, we're talking 1960s, 70s, trying to come up with the measurement at a time when it was much harder to get the data. You didn't have the computational power. And so a lot of it's remarkable how well you can do with just simple transaction log data. If you simply know who bought what, when, and for how much, that's all you need. You don't need to overcomplicate it. You don't have to worry about where are they in the social graph. You don't have to worry about bioinformation. You don't have to worry about geolocation. And in particular, if I could point out one thing that we got to learn to let go of, it's demographics. That it's just so tempting. We think we're so good at just kind of looking at a customer, whether it's B2B or B2C, and just kind of sizing up that person or that business and saying, that's a good one. That's much more fallible than you think and isn't nearly as informative or predictive as simple, boring transaction log data. So let go of your stereotypes, let go of your intuition, trust the data, but keep it simple in that regard.
I really like this concept of back to the forefathers of direct marketing because I actually have a little bit of experience in that myself, going back to like the late 80s, early 90s. And I can see how it applies to B2B, but how can you apply this to a fast-moving consumer goods type of situation?
Sure. It is a great question. And that's really been one of the barriers to make customer centricity a full-fledged corporate-wide strategy. See, let's just use a couple of analogies over here. If you have a small business, you have kind of one shop, and you kind of know a lot of the customers who come in and out. You know who the good ones are. You know who the ones who are going to stay with you. And you find ways to kind of add value to them that you might not do for everybody else. So on a really small scale, this idea of customer centricity, that not all customers are created equal and all that stuff, it comes naturally. But then you open up the second store and then the third one. Yep. And then you kind of lose touch and you kind of give up on all that. And then you kind of naturally, without even thinking about it, shift your focus away from celebrating those different customers. And it becomes much more focused just on the product and service. Let's just get the thing out there and do it as efficiently as possible. My contention is that it's much different today than it was in the 80s and 90s. And with the kinds of data, analytics, and technology that are at everybody's fingertips, we can do a pretty good job of kind of sizing up customer value, projecting it ahead, and figuring out ways, without going too deep, but to be able to customize the offering and the relationship at full commercial scale and build our business around it with the same kind of vigor that we would have done in that one location mom and pop store. I think that the time has come that we can kind of bust out of those constraints and do this even for very large companies.
Yeah, it's almost like you're talking about, with technology and with databases, data sets, data analytics, you kind of recreate the village shopkeeper who knew all of his customers and knew exactly what they wanted and serviced them, but you're just doing it sort of in a modern way.
That's right. And of course, there are some limitations that you lose out, let's say, on body language and emotions and things like that. But at the same time, as I said before, sometimes those cues actually hurt us as much as they help us. And so by being a little bit more data-driven, by relying a little bit more on that CRM system, you can find a bit more consistency and accountability that just helps this whole idea scale. And in many cases, figuring out who those best customers are, finding ways to work with them, extract value out of them, and acquire more like them can be more sustainably profitable than just that obsessive focus just on the product itself.
My guest on the CX Leader podcast this week is Peter Fader. He is a professor of marketing at the Wharton School in the University of Pennsylvania, and he's also co-author of the book, The Customer Centricity Playbook. Tell us a little bit about the book, Peter. How'd you come up with this, and just give us a little bit of a taste of what's in it?
Well, as I said at the outset, I was looking at a lot of these patterns of customer behavior, these models that would tend to capture and forecast them really well, going around a company saying, here, you got to use this stuff. And the companies would be, again, somewhat dismissive. So I did two things starting around 10 years ago. Number one, I wrote my first book on customer centricity with that title, Customer Centricity, Focus on the Right Customers for Strategic Advantage. It was just a call to action. It was a Hey, there's this other strategy out there. Let me define it for you. Let me motivate it. Let me make it aspirational. Just something for you to think about, that the usual product-centric ways aren't as good or sustainable as you think. So that was one thing. Is I wrote the first book. The new book is much more about implementation. Now that you get it, now that you really want to do it, and you kind of understand some of the basic elements involved, how do you align them? How do you prioritize them? So the new book really is, I mean, the subtitle literally is Implement a Winning Strategy Driven by Customer Lifetime Value. But then the second branch of my, attempts to transform the world starts with those words that I just mentioned, customer lifetime value. I found that a lot of companies, even if they would get the basic ideas that I'm talking about, they would still be reluctant to go out there and wave the magic CLV wand. So I started up a company back in 2015 called Zodiac. And that was the sole purpose of the company, was to bring customer valuation to life at full commercial scale. And we worked with all kinds of retailers and telcos and gaming companies and pharmaceuticals and travel and hospitality, and you name it. We built hundreds and hundreds of models for a nice variety of companies, big and small, domestic, international, B2B, B2C, all around the world, to basically show them that you really can project the value of the customers and all these use cases that would arise from them once you can see and trust the numbers. And so that was a wonderful exercise for me. Again, taking the academic and coming into the real world and then bringing stuff back. It was a great experience, a great education. Nike bought that company last year, which itself was a great validation that these models work and that big companies can actually benefit from them. So it's been this 1-2 punch of concepts and frameworks as well as math and numbers that's really managed to kind of get a lot of attention and a lot of companies starting to run experiments in this direction.
If our listeners wanted to pick up the book, is it easy to get?
Absolutely. So yeah, both books, they're published by Wharton Digital Press. They're available on Amazon and all the usual outlets. And again, there's a nice complementarity to them. One laying out the ideas, the other saying how we do it. And I should just add one other thing. It's one thing to read about all this customer centricity stuff and say, yeah, I get it, or I'm concerned about that. The other part of the kind of portfolio is a new simulation game that I developed with my co-author from the second book, Sarah Toms. You and many of your listeners have played some kind of business simulation, like, hey, you have the product here, who should we sell it to? But we have a customer centricity simulation where it's kind of take that usual idea and flip it on its head, that the goal here isn't to sell as much stuff as possible. The goal is to develop and maintain as profitable a customer base as possible. So which kinds of customers do we want to acquire? How much do we want to spend to do so? How much should we allocate to acquisition versus the retention development of existing customers? And what about things like loyalty programs, referral programs, strategic account management, premium services, CRM systems? A lot of the things that you and your listeners have just kind of playing around with these days or wondering if they should be using. Let's really put the focus on those kinds of tactics to see how best we should use them or perhaps ignore them in order to really grow that profitable customer base. That's the new world that we're moving into. And a lot of the old marketing 101 courses that many of us took or taught just don't really cut it anymore.
Hey, I'm really interested in your simulation because actually some colleagues of mine about 10 years ago developed a card game we call it Face Value. And it's basically you play it at a table with 4 to 6 or 7 people like you play cards, but the idea is to amass the best portfolio of customers.
Wow.
Given like imperfect information. At the start of the game, you don't know what all the information means, but as the game goes on, but it's really a nice thing. So we need to talk offline on that.
We will definitely exchange ideas about that. I have to say, yours is the first of anything that I've heard about. I've been out there talking about this sim and delivering it to companies for several years now. And actually, I find that super encouraging. To me, the more the better. I want to really legitimize these ideas and not just be this kind of wacko going against the grain. So that's very encouraging.
I always like that saying, Peter, that all the significant change in the world came from somebody that was a wacko originally, right?
Right. Well, I'm proud to be that, whether it's going against conventional business strategies or even going against conventional kind of values as an academic.
Do you have an idea for a topic that you'd like us to cover? A suggestion on how we can improve the program? Or just want to let us know how much you enjoy listening? Email the CX Leader Podcast at podcast@walkerinfo.com. We'd love to hear your feedback on how we're doing. That's podcast@walkerinfo.com.
So, Peter, I'm fascinated with this idea of going to the financial people. I can't tell you how many times in my career I've had pushback from CX pros that say, I can't get that kind of data. I can't get that kind of, actual transaction or financial data because it doesn't exist in my company. What would you say to that?
It does exist, and too often it just hasn't been prioritized enough, or it's sitting in a different part of the organization. So these days, I'm actually starting the conversation in finance because they have the data. Now, they're going to tend to ignore the transaction logs. They're just going to roll it all up and say, what are sales? What are revenues? But if we can take that data and break it down and understand how much of it is arriving from new customers versus existing ones, and just all those patterns under the surface that we as marketers really care about, the people in accounting and finance couldn't care less about, then we can create just wonderful synergies across those two functional areas. So the big thing that I'm working on these days, both in terms of research and practice, is what I call customer-based corporate valuation. That if I can project how many customers we're going to acquire and how long they're going to stay and what they're going to do and how profitably that will be for the company, I can actually do a better job of forecasting revenue and estimating overall corporate valuation compared to the people in finance. And I can do so using marketing concepts, marketing methods. And when the CFO says, this is pretty cool, this works, tell me what more we can do with it, then we could toss it over the cubicle to the CMO and all of a sudden give her that much more power to be able to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, but with the complete blessing and the active interest of the folks in finance.
Peter, I could talk to you all day, and I think that you have some fascinating ideas that maybe we'll have you back on again at some point if you'd be willing, but we got to keep these podcasts to commute length. So with that, I wanted to go to the hallmark of our program, and that's take-home value. I think narrowing you down to one or two of your best tips is going to be difficult. But if you would, just for our practitioners out there, what's one thing or two things that our listener today could take from this podcast and help them improve their overall CX program?
Absolutely. Yeah, because you're giving you a lot of big, lofty ideas, although I stand by them all. But let me come back to the idea of customer lifetime value and to get really, really specific about it and go back to our forefathers in direct marketing. The key ingredients to calculate customer lifetime value and therefore to evaluate any kind of program that you're doing is RFM. So this is a tip of the hat to direct marketers. This isn't my content, but I'm so happy to call attention to it. The information that you need to project the value of your customers is recency, frequency, and monetary value. So just tell me the last time someone bought from me, how many purchases or interactions they've had over the past, say, 2 years, and the average size or some other notion of value of those interactions. And if you give me those three numbers at a customer level, that's all I want. I don't need to know anything else. In fact, I'll reject anything else that you give me. So I want to be able to do these lifetime value calculations in a manner that's simple, in a manner that's very consistent across different settings, and a manner that's going to be very comparable, so we can really compare different programs or segments to each other. So RFM is something that really should be kind of in everyone's mind and in everyone's customer dashboard.
That's awesome. Peter Fader is the professor of marketing at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's also co-author of a book the Customer Centricity Playbook. Peter, thanks a bunch for being on the podcast today. Is there an easy way that maybe our listeners could reach out to you? Do you have a LinkedIn profile or website or something?
I do, yeah. LinkedIn and actually Twitter, at FaderP, or just Google my name. I'm just very, very eager to keep this conversation going. Like I've been saying multiple times now, we're just getting going now. So other folks who have questions or have some really good or even bad experiences in this area, very happy to connect with them.
And if you want to talk about anything you heard on this episode or about how Walker might be able to help your business customer experience, you can contact me at steve.walker@walkerinformation.com or call me here in the U.S. at +1 317 843 8890. Don't hesitate to reach out. Love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the CX Leader Podcast. You can go to walkerinfo.com/podcast and you'll find links to iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play. And now we're on our own YouTube channel as well. Simply go to walkerinfo.tv to listen. Thank you for listening to the CX Leader Podcast, which is a production of Walker. We're an experience management firm that can help you create competitive advantage through your customer experience. And if you haven't heard already, we're the 2019 Qualtrics CX Partner of the Year. Find out more at walkerinfo.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.